So glad you are joining us today, whether you are live or right here in the house or online. I have some of my favorite people are here today, and some of you are brand new. It's your first time, either tracking with us online, on podcast, or maybe here. We are so glad you are here. And here's what I know. The baptisms, isn't that amazing? Stories of God's true and tangible life change. That's what we're about as the Orchard. Not conforming to something, but being transformed by someone. And so next week, we have our big Baptism Sunday. I want to encourage you to make time for that, to come out as a family, or maybe yourself, meet some new people, have some fun, and see and hear the stories of life change. And perhaps it's you. Perhaps it's you that has a story of life change that needs to be told. I know as we gather in places like this, I feel every Sunday that for as much as church is a part of some of our routines and our rhythms, there are others of us who show up on days like this who are absolutely in need of God to show up in our lives. When we show up on the verge of breakdown, or something is already breaking, and we are needing God desperately to come through in some ways. And I had emails all this week from some amazingly honest people, and then also just conversations this morning of what God is doing, and many of you of what you hope that God can do. And I want to say this, my prayer today is that you hear in the short time I have that God has something for you and sees you in your story and knows where you are. Today we're looking at this book of Exodus, and we're only a few weeks away from being done. And I say that like we're about to be done with the book of Exodus and go into August. And as we finish it, you didn't have to be here for all the rest of it to understand what we're talking about today. But we're looking at these people who were led out of slavery. They were led to Mount Sinai, and God up on Mount Sinai, He gave them the 10 Commandments, and He gave them the law. He fed them, He watered them, He led them, He spoke to them. He gave them a covenant and said, "You'll be my people, and I'm going to be your God," a promise. And what did they do? They obeyed, right? If you're a parent, your kids obey right away. No, they broke it right away. They had a golden calf and they worshiped it and said, "This is our God." And God in His mercy forgave them. And He's taking them to the promised land. It's called the promised land because it was promised to Abraham 700 years prior. A glorious destination. This term promised land holds meaning for all of us. Each of you has a promised land in your life. For them, it means getting out of slavery and out of injustice and out of their children being enslaved and killed and out of their nomadic life, out of their wandering, and finally having a home. And for many of us, what's the promised land? Each of you has a promised land in your character that God is leading you toward, in your relationships, in your business perhaps. God is leading us to new places, new seasons. And like these people here in Exodus, we often find ourselves in the wilderness, hoping for a promised land. We're not back where we used to be, but we're not yet where we want to be. We're in the middle. And next week, we're going to talk about that single thing the whole time. Today, we're talking about a very specific instance that happened. As they're at Mount Sinai, and guess what? They get to leave. They've been there for a year. At the bottom of the mountain, hearing from God and hearing from Moses, and they're about to leave and embark and go up to the promised land. They're actually going to get a taste of it. They're going to have the chance to put their slavery behind them, their wandering behind them. Now this journey, we know it's a long journey in the wilderness, but did you know they're only in like year 2, and they're about to get to the promised land? It could have been over really quick. This week we find them moving through the wilderness and coming up to the edge of it, and what does Moses do? He sends out 12 leaders to go check it out and come back and tell us what it's like. They're right there, and it says there in Numbers 13, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the promised land, which I'm giving my people. From each tribe, send one leader." So from the 12 tribes, go 12 leaders, and they go into the land, and they see amazing things. And they come back with fruits and all kinds of food. And verse 26, they came back to Moses and the whole community. Everyone's waiting to hear. And they reported to them and the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. I mean, this has got to be amazing. They don't have to eat manna anymore. They don't have to wander through the wilderness. They can put down roots. They can have a home. This will be their new season, their new normal as they finally have this promised land. But the spies, the 12 leaders, they gave Moses this account. "We went into the land that you sent us. Yes, it flows with milk and honey, and here's the fruit. But," there's a big giant but here, The people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and large, and we saw the descendants of Anak there. And right away, we begin to see that this good news comes with something else. It's an amazing report of the promised land and what is ahead. But, as often happens, with promised lands come giants. There's these people there, and they're huge. They're giants. They're fearful. They're terrible in great size. And so we have a good report with a bad report. Great things ahead, but terrible things ahead. And isn't our life like this so often? We're working toward, God's working us toward something, a breakthrough in some area, but what are we facing? Well, you're likely facing somewhere in your life today, uncertainty. And if there's one thing I've found that humans hate, it's uncertainty. We want to manage, control, and know everything about uncertainty we can. In fact, when you're uncertain, when you have a cough and you're uncertain, what do? Go to WebMD. And what does that tell you? Well, you certainly have something really bad. We will choose the pain of the perceived certainty over the uncertainty. We can't stand uncertainty. And so here they have this land ahead of them, this promise of God, and you have a promise ahead of you, each of you, in different areas of your character and life. You have a promise ahead that God's working you toward. And of course, with that, life brings giants and problems. God is moving us into all these places. And if I had time, and if we all had the courage, I would take the mic around and let each one of you tell us what your giants are. Like, what's the biggest thing you're facing right now in your life? And some of you are dying at even the thought of that. But here's the truth. With this many people in this room and tracking along, that's how many different giants we have. Each of you with something in your life you're facing that causes you uncertainty and fear. They come in all forms: a diagnosis, the breaking of a relationship, the lack of a relationship, perhaps a child in difficulty, a decision ahead that's large and looming, that you don't know the way, a hardship, perhaps a death, a breakup or a breakdown or a loss. They come in many different ways, many different forms. God leads us, and He's leading you to a promised land, and life brings us giants. In the midst of all this, one of the 12 leaders named Caleb, he speaks up. In verse 30, then Caleb silenced the people who were panicked, and he said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Caleb wants to go, even though it's full of giants and trouble. Unfortunately, Caleb is outnumbered. There's only two voices that say, our God is great. He's been with us. Do you remember what God's done? Do you remember how God took us out of slavery? Do you remember all the plagues and the signs and wonders that He's done in our past? That same God who did those things is with us in this thing. Only 2 of the 12 voiced those opinions and those truths. Isn't that in our lives as well? You face a new crisis, and if you could just sit down, there's a part of you that would say, do you remember the God who took you through the previous one? Do you remember the God who walked you through each step and provided for you and gave you peace and power and guided this point? Do you remember Him? Yeah, but you have no idea how big it is now. I don't know if He can do this one. We face this very thing within us, of voices of faith reminding what has happened, but voices of fear looking ahead. It says this, verse 31, but the men who had gone up with Caleb said, we can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are. They're stronger. They're bigger. Do you know how big the diagnosis is? Do you know how broken this relationship is? Do you know how big this decision is? Do you know what I'm facing? Yeah, God was good then, but that was just like getting out of slavery and plagues. This is giants. You notice how we minimize the past problems and magnify the present problems? We'll talk about that. It makes you wonder, why were 2 of these leaders so confident that they could continue on with God's power, while others were so sure they would lose? One of the leaders, who is one of the voices that said, let's move forward if God's for us, let's go, his name was Joshua. And Joshua is the person who would go up with Moses into the presence of God at Mount Sinai. So often Moses was near when God would come down. He felt the mountain rumble. He felt the flames of the fire. He felt the rolling of the thunder of God's voice. He's been in God's presence. And when someone's been in God's presence, they often view problems differently. And Joshua was one of those. He went up into God's presence, while so many of them did not. Joshua knows the awesome presence and power of God. He has seen God's greatness, not only in Egypt and the signs, but there in his own life. You see, on paper, the majority of the leaders were correct. The giants are bigger. The problems are greater. On paper, yes. But for Joshua, he saw the giants for what they were, and he knew something. He knew algebra. You guys like algebra? Me neither. I can't stand math. I won't even get into my issues with math. Like I have an issue with math. Yeah, anyway, algebra is everything. We have all these other leaders saying that the problems are too big, and we have Caleb and Joshua saying, our God is bigger. The difference is algebra. You see, there's a formula that most of us work on. Me plus my problems is going to equal defeat. And whatever the problem is, whatever the diagnosis, the decision, the dysfunction, whatever it would be, me and that giant, oh, I know what's going to happen there. I'm terrified. Me and the uncertainty, that's going to be defeat. It's natural. That's the way oftentimes that we respond. Joshua, his math was a little different. You see, because of God's presence and how he knew God in his size, it's me times the variable. And the variable was God. Me times the variable. In whatever circumstance, in whatever giant, in whatever uncertainty I face, has a different outcome. You see, the only difference was a variable that they put in there. And their experience, Joshua's experience, he had experienced God in tangible moments, experiencing God's presence in his own life. And he knew there was a resource there far bigger, far greater than any giant. And he had that variable in his faith. You see, these two believed that the variable was the difference maker. That no matter how big the giant is, no matter how great the uncertainty is, no matter how big the decision is, that God is greater. And Joshua and Caleb's perspective always included this: God's promise and God's presence. We need to begin to put that into our thinking, our feeling, our faithing, our hoping. Because without that variable of God's greatness and promise and presence, then it truly is just looking at the problem and the giants and the uncertainty and fear. If God wanted them to go forward, then who, what, anything would stand against them. Because Joshua knew it wasn't standing against him, it was standing against God. You see, Joshua had been there and seen Pharaoh. He knew that no king, that no power on earth could stand before God. You see, 10 of these leaders, 10 of these spies had their eyes on the problem. 2 of them had their eyes set on God. Did they see the giants? Yes. Yes, they saw them. I'm not teaching you that fake Christianity where like, just ignore it and it doesn't exist. No, problems are real. The uncertainty's there. The fear is palpable. All 12 spies, all leaders went through the exact same experience. They all went into the land. They all saw the same thing. They all came back with different reports. What they focused on made all the difference, didn't it? What they chose to focus on made all the difference. It gets worse. Verse 31, the men who had gone up with Caleb and Joshua said, we can't attack them, they're stronger. And then skipping down to verse 33, we saw the descendants and we seemed like grasshoppers. I love that sentence. We seemed like grasshoppers in whose eyes? In our own eyes. I look at my problems and I seem small. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Now, they don't know what anybody else thinks, but compared to my problems, I seem so small. Their perspective on their life and who they are and their problems is very clear. In verse 32, it says, they spread a bad report through all the land, and bad news spreads faster than good news. This bad news sells and gets more eyeballs and more advertising than good news. And so as it goes through the people, verse 1, the next chapter says, that night all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All of God's people grumbled against Moses, and the whole assembly said, oh, if only we had died in Egypt. If only we died in the wilderness. It's been 2 years. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land just to go get killed in battle? our wives and children taken as plunder. And they said to each other, they looked at their neighbor, we should just choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And we look at that and go, are you kidding me? You want to go back to slavery? Generational slavery? What, your children being taken from you? You want to go, imagine if this happened. Imagine if God goes, okay. And they get this new leader, Carl. And Carl goes, all right, we're going back. And Carl leads them, and they go back to the new Pharaoh and go, we want our old job back. You mean the ones we were slaves? Yeah. We want to do that again. Why? Because the certain pain that we're familiar with is more comfortable than the unknown, uncertain pain that we're imagining. And we can't blame them too much here because we do this all the time. I would rather deal with the certainty of the pain and dysfunction I know than to venture forth in faith into the discomfort of the uncertainty I don't. That shows you how much as humans we can't stand uncertainty. And just as an aside, we will minimize uncertainty. We will try to control uncertainty. We will avoid uncertainty. Faith, by its very nature, lives in uncertainty. The very ground that your faith works is the area you're trying to make as small as possible. Do you need faith for the places you have complete certainty? No. It's those places of uncertainty where your faith gets to stand, where you get to step out, where you get to actually exercise your faith. And those are the areas we're so terrified of. We will do anything but go there. And that's where our faith is actually good. That's where it works. That's what it was made for. And so we are avoiding the very place that our faith was built for. Fear has so gripped these people that they are longing for an old life as opposed to the uncertainty of what's ahead. A, because now we know what they're focused on. The problems are so big. And B, they just don't know God. They don't know how big God is. They look at these people and they say, to them we look like grasshoppers. Did it ever occur to them to compare those people to God? Did it ever occur to you to compare your problems to the size of God? The size of your problem to the size of your God. If you compare the size of your problem to your own self, yeah, you might be in some big trouble. But compare the size of your problem to the size of the God who's with you. Our problems will always be giant if our perspective of God is small. That's why we have to be going into His presence, learning His nature, discovering who He is, rooting our faith. Because in places of uncertainty, faith is what you have. It's what He's given you. And the more you see Him for who He is and know Him for who He is, the greater and the grander you see His power and presence. And it puts things into perspective. And some of you are against some very big things in your life right now. And you need a big God. You need to be reminded of a big God. We're shown in Exodus and Numbers that Joshua loved being in the presence of God. And because he knew how big God was, he knew the correct proportion of his problems and the giants and the uncertainty. So what giants are you facing in your life? What uncertainty are you facing in your life right now? You know how big it seems. No one else knows the tears, the anxiety, how many times you think about it during the day, how even the smallest thing can remind you, no one knows the true size of what you're dealing with internally. They cause fear, and they can cause our faith to crumble unless we know correctly the size of our God. And that's why it's so important to know Him. When you fix your faith on God, it changes your perspective on your giants. When you take your perspective and focus off your problems and fix them on God and His presence and who He is, it puts things in correct proportion. You see, here's the truth. We never go to a giant or uncertainty or difficulty and look for peace and hope and courage, do we? No, they cause the opposite. Like Caleb, like Joshua, we set our heart and we gaze upon God, our focus on God. And then you get to see who the grasshopper is. Or from Joshua, when you get into God's presence, your perspective on your problem changes. The proportion of your problem shifts. Because giants truly are dwarfed by the power of God. If you want hope, if you need hope today, I want you to check what you're setting your heart and mind on. And for some of you, that is a hard one. If you need hope today, what are you setting your heart and mind on? Where's my faith? What's it set on? Am I comparing myself to my giants, or am I comparing my giants to my God? One of the greatest things we can learn from this is that we get to choose what we fix our focus on. Here, I'm just going to give a spoiler alert. Life will always have giants. It will always have uncertainty. You cannot control your way out of them. We don't live in paradise yet. There will be a day, but not now. There will always be challenges. Life happens. Giants happen, as the bumper sticker says, right? Instead of focusing on the terrible things and what could go wrong, part of our practice is to focus on our God and His presence. Because He gives us perspective when things are so challenging. And so I want to encourage you in this, to find yourself like Joshua in His presence. I want to encourage you to jump into groups. We have our community groups with Pastor Dan and talking about these things and finding people who are also going through those things, or our free counseling that we have here. Whatever it takes, we want to pray for you at the end of the service. The reality is that giants are here in Exodus, and it's a pattern all through the Bible because giants happen in life. And it goes to the time of Jesus, and it goes beyond, and it goes into your life, and you have giants. And it's because they're common. I mean, in 1 Samuel 17, a giant named Goliath was terrorizing an entire nation. A whole army sat frozen, staring out, focused on a giant, terrified. And one young man named David, looking out, was focused on the size of his God. And what does it say? There's a line in that story that I just love. It says, David ran toward the battle. He sprinted. He was ready to go. He wasn't focused on how big Goliath was. He could see him. He knew how big his God was. In the time of Jesus, Jesus calls Peter to step out of a perfectly good boat and walk on water. And Peter gets out, and he's focused on Jesus. He's focused on the correct thing, and he's walking upon the waves and the storm. But what happens? What happens? He begins to lose and change his focus. He shifts his focus to the uncertainty and the trials and the storms of life. And then he begins to sink. He begins to sink. And what changed was he shifted his focus. So where in your life are you focused on all the storm and everything? Because here's the truth. While Peter focused on the person of Jesus, he was overcoming. When he focused on the problem, he was overwhelmed. Which are you today? Are you overwhelmed? Are you just trying to tread water and stay above all that's happening? It could be because you are focused on the problems and the giants and the uncertainty. When you're focused like Peter on your Savior, even in the midst of a storm, there is overcoming. Giants will always be there. Trials and storms and difficulty are part of life. It's not a matter of what we can do to avoid them or just to have a life without them. It's what we do in them. When we focus on the size of our problem, we are frozen in fear. But when we focus on the size of our God, we can step forward in faith. And for many of you here today who are up against these giants, God sees you, God knows what you're going through, and He has presence, peace, tangible peace for you. And like Joshua, it is found in His presence. It is found in His presence, in His word, in His prayer, in getting to know His nature. These are the things we're here at the Orchard, not just to learn about God, not just to read the Word, but to do what it says and to begin to know Him more. And I'm going to encourage you to step into these areas because if you're not facing a giant now, you're going to need it. It happens. When you focus on the size of your problem, you get frozen in fear. When you focus on the size of your God, you can step forward in faith. As we close this, and as we go into worship, and sing about the God who is the way maker, who makes a way through things even when they're difficult, I'm going to have a prayer team in the back over here, some men and women who want to pray with you. Because some of you here today, the last thing you want to do is go get prayed for, and probably the thing you need most is to bring your prayer to somebody because you're facing some big giants and big uncertainty. We want to pray with you. So I'll have some friends back there, men and women, to pray with you. I'll be up here. Pastor Dan, will you be up here? I would encourage you to get some prayer. For others of us, let's stand and let's worship the God who, even when we can't see that he's working, even when all we can see is giants, he's making a way. Let's worship.